He believed his badge made him untouchable, right until he arrested the wrong military officer. For 10 years, Riverside trembled under the shadow of Officer Robert Tate. He was more than a cop, he was a phantom, a predator with a badge, his targets the city's most vulnerable. Black-owned businesses became his personal hunting grounds, young men his prey, fear his weapon. Complaints, they vanished like whispers in the wind, his superiors inexplicably blind to his reign of terror. But what happens when an untouchable officer makes one crucial, catastrophic error? What happens when he pulls over Lieutenant Colonel Maya Reynolds? For 10 years, Officer Robert Tate patrolled the streets of Riverside with an air of untouchability. He wasn't just another cop, he was the kind of officer who believed the badge gave him unlimited power. To his fellow officers, he was known as someone who brought in good numbers, the kind of guy who knew how to write a report just right to justify his stops. To the black and minority communities in Riverside, he was something else entirely. A bully with a badge, the kind of officer who would park outside black-owned businesses, just watching, making sure they knew he was there. The kind who would follow young black men for miles, waiting for the slightest excuse to flip on his sirens. And the worst part? He always got away with it. Officer Tate had a long list of so-called suspicious stops. He detained Marcus Green, a high school teacher, because he fit the description of a suspect. He pulled over a Latina mother for a broken taillight, only to question her about her immigration status. He arrested an elderly Asian woman for loitering after she took too long to cross the street. The community complained, over and over, but every complaint seemed to disappear before it went anywhere. Why? Because Tate had friends in high places. His superiors loved him because he brought in arrests. He knew how to phrase his reports to make it sound like his actions were justified. Subject exhibited suspicious behavior. Officer feared for his safety. The suspect became aggressive. The same words, the same excuses every single time. And because of those well-worded lies, no one ever challenged him. The other officers saw it. They whispered about it in the break room. They shook their heads after his stops, but they never said a word. Because who would believe the complaints of civilians over the word of a decorated officer? Tate loved that. It empowered him. He wore his badge like a shield, a symbol of his untouchability. But there's something about men like Tate. They always start believing their own lies. And that's exactly when life teaches them the hardest lessons. Because karma doesn't care about your badge, and it was coming for him, in the form of someone who wasn't afraid to fight back. 20 years in the Army. 2 tours in Afghanistan. More medals than Officer Tate had traffic citations. But you wouldn't know any of that just by looking at Lieutenant Colonel Maya Reynolds. She wasn't the type to brag about her achievements. Most days, you'd find her at the local Veterans Center, helping fellow soldiers navigate the system. Everyone deserves a fighting chance, she always said. And she meant it. The same discipline that had earned her those medals. She used it to help others, veterans who felt lost, who needed someone who knew how to fight for them. She had spent years teaching young soldiers about discipline, respect, and justice. And in just a few hours, she was about to give Officer Tate a lesson he'd never forget. That Tuesday morning started like any other. Maya was driving to the Veterans Center in her Toyota Camry, nothing fancy. That wasn't her style. She had just finished her morning run, still wearing her Army PT shirt, the same shirt she had worn hundreds of times before. As she stopped at a red light, she noticed something in the rearview mirror. A police cruiser. At first, she thought nothing of it. But then she noticed the way the officer was staring through his windshield at her. Her instincts kicked in. 20 years in the military teaches you to read situations quickly. She did what she had trained others to do in situations like this. Checked her seatbelt. Turned down the radio. Kept both hands visible on the wheel. Standard procedure. Because Maya Reynolds didn't just know the rules, she wrote some of them. The light turned green. She drove exactly the speed limit. The patrol car stayed behind her. 3 blocks, 4 blocks. She knew this game all too well. Then came the red and blue lights flashing behind her. Maya sighed, not in fear, but in disappointment. Another day in America, another random traffic stop. But this one was about to be different. Because Officer Robert Tate had no idea that the woman he was pulling over had spent 2 decades teaching military police how to handle authority the right way. He had no idea that she documented everything. He had no idea that she knew every regulation he was about to break. He just thought he had power. He was about to learn the hard way what real power looked like. Officer Tate swaggered up to the driver's side window, his expression already set in stone. License and registration. His voice had that edge, that tone that said he had already decided how this was going to go. Maya reached slowly, deliberately for her documents, narrating each movement. "I'm reaching for my credentials in the glove compartment, officer." She handed him 3 things: her driver's license, her vehicle registration, her military ID. Tate barely glanced at the first 2. But when his eyes landed on the military ID, his face changed. Not impressed. Suspicious. "You expect me to believe this is real?" he scoffed. Maya's expression didn't change. "Yes, sir. I am Lieutenant Colonel Maya Reynolds, currently stationed at..." Tate cut her off with a laugh. "Right? And I'm the Secretary of Defense. Step out of the vehicle now." Maya had been in tougher situations. But the way Tate's hand hovered near his holster, the way his eyes narrowed with hostility, she knew. This stop wasn't about any traffic violation. Maya stayed calm. "Officer Tate," she read his nameplate. "May I ask why I'm being asked to exit my vehicle?" She had a phone recording everything, placed carefully on the dashboard, a habit from years of training others. Tate's smirk twisted. "Playing lawyer now?" he sneered. "Fine, I saw you swerving. Probably drunk. Out, now." Maya knew she hadn't swerved once. Her dash cam would prove it later. She stepped out, still calm, still professional. But then, Tate grabbed her arm, rough enough to leave marks. "Spread your legs, hands on the car." Maya's voice remained steady. "I believe this constitutes excessive force." The handcuffs clicked before she could finish her sentence. Tate leaned in, whispering as he shoved her toward his patrol car. "Not so high and mighty now, Colonel." He had no idea. He had just started a war with someone who knew exactly how to fight it. And his world was about to come crashing down. The booking room at Riverside Police Station was deliberately cold, the kind of cold designed to make people feel small, powerless, broken down before they even got to speak. But Lieutenant Colonel Maya Reynolds had spent 20 years in the Army. She had faced interrogations, war zones, and high-stakes negotiations. This was nothing. Officer Robert Tate, however, had no idea what was coming. Tate dragged Maya into the station, grinning smugly as he waved her military ID in the air like a trophy. "Look what we got here," he announced to his fellow officers, his voice filled with mocking amusement. Another fake military hero trying to talk her way out of a ticket. Some of the officers in the station exchanged uneasy glances. Others, they just looked away, because deep down they knew what Tate was. And now he had just messed with the wrong person. One officer in particular, Sergeant Elena Vasquez, immediately recognized Maya's name. She grabbed the military ID from Tate's hand, inspecting it closely. Her face paled. Tate frowned. "What's your problem?" Vasquez didn't answer. Instead, she pulled Tate into a corner of the room, her voice dropping to a sharp whisper. "Are you out of your mind?" she hissed. "Do you even know who you just arrested?" Tate scoffed. "Yeah, some woman who thought flashing a fake military ID would." "She's a Lieutenant Colonel Tate," Vasquez cut him off. "A decorated officer, 2 tours in Afghanistan, 20 years of service." Tate froze. For the first time, doubt flickered in his eyes. Vasquez continued, her voice dangerously low. Do you know what happens when you arrest someone like that under false charges? Tate's smirk faltered. But before he could answer, Maya, still seated in cuffs, calmly spoke up. Sergeant Vasquez, Maya said, her voice composed but authoritative. I'd like to make my one phone call now. She didn't call a lawyer. She didn't call a friend. She called Judge Advocate General Daniel Carter, one of the highest-ranking military officials in the state. And she put the call on speaker. Lieutenant Colonel Reynolds. Carter's voice boomed through the phone. Tell me exactly what happened. Maya detailed everything, the bogus traffic stop, the false accusation, the excessive force. The entire room fell silent as Carter listened. Then came his response. You have exactly 1 hour to release her. Carter's voice boomed through the phone, filled with authority and restrained fury. Before I personally contact the police commissioner, the mayor's office, and the Department of Justice. Tate went pale. His hand instinctively went to his belt, as if adjusting his uniform could somehow fix what he had just done. Vasquez, meanwhile, turned on him instantly. You need to let her go, right now. But Tate wasn't ready to give up. His arrogance had gotten him this far, and in his mind, he still had a way out. Look, he said, raising his hands in mock innocence, maybe she's in the military, so what? That doesn't mean she wasn't resisting. Sergeant Vasquez cut him off. Resisting? She repeated, her eyes burning with disgust. You just tried to railroad a lieutenant colonel, someone who's trained officers like us. She knows every rule better than you do, and you really think you can spin this? Tate didn't answer, because he didn't have one. Maya, however, had plenty to say. She stood up slowly, rubbing her bruised wrists where the cuffs had been too tight. Every officer in the room was now watching. I want every officer here to understand something, Maya said, her voice clear, unwavering. What happened today, it ends here. She looked directly at Tate. Not just for me, but for every person who's ever been targeted, harassed, or falsely accused by you, because I guarantee you, I'm not the first. Tate flinched, because he knew she was right. He had gotten away with it before. But this time, he had picked the wrong woman to mess with. Vasquez pulled Tate aside again, her voice sharp. You better pray nothing happens to that dashcam footage, she warned, because if I find out you tampered with evidence, I'll personally see to it that you never wear a badge again. Tate didn't respond, because he knew he had already lost. Less than an hour later, Maya was officially released. But she wasn't done. As she walked out of the station, she pulled out her phone and made another call. Not to the media. Not to a civil rights attorney. No, this call was to internal affairs investigator Rachel Park, someone who had been collecting complaints against Tate for years, waiting for a case strong enough to bring him down. Rachel, Maya said, her voice calm but firm, I have everything you need to take him down for good. Park didn't hesitate. Send me what you have, she said, it's time. The next morning, Tate strolled into the precinct, acting like nothing had happened. Then he noticed the stares, the whispers. His usual parking spot was taken. His coffee mug had mysteriously vanished from the break room. Little things, warning signs. And then his partner requested a transfer to another unit. The first domino had fallen. Meanwhile, across town, Maya sat in a small office with Rachel Park. She placed a USB drive on the table. Show me everything, Maya said. Not just her dashcam footage. Not just her phone recording. She had something better. For the past 5 years, Maya explained, veterans from my support group have been documenting every interaction with Officer Tate. She slid a spreadsheet across the table. Dates, times, incidents, witnesses, all meticulously organized. Rachel Park's eyes widened as she scrolled through the data. 37 incidents, 15 formal complaints. All until now. This is thorough, Park admitted. Maya wasn't finished. She slid her phone across the table. Check your email, she said. Rachel opened it. Statements from 3 officers who had witnessed Tate's misconduct. A copy of every complaint that had mysteriously disappeared. Dashcam footage Tate thought no one had kept. Park leaned back in her chair, exhaling sharply. "This," she said, shaking her head, "this is enough to end him." Maya nodded. "Then let's make sure it does." For years, Officer Robert Tate had operated without consequence. 37 complaints, 15 formal investigations, yet every time he had walked away untouched, protected by a system that valued loyalty over accountability. But this time was different. Because Lieutenant Colonel Maya Reynolds wasn't just another victim. She was a strategist, a leader, a soldier trained to dismantle systems from the inside. And she was about to do exactly that. The morning after her release, Maya sat across from Internal Affairs investigator Rachel Park, her hands resting on the USB drive filled with evidence. "Officer Tate's been careful," Maya said, her tone measured, "but not careful enough." Park plugged in the drive, scanning the files. Dashcam footage Tate thought was deleted. Statements from victims who had been afraid to speak. Records of complaints that had mysteriously disappeared. The deeper Park scrolled, the more her expression hardened. "This is," she exhaled sharply, "this is enough to bury him." Maya nodded. "That's the plan." While Park built the case, Maya focused on gathering witnesses. And the most surprising witness came from inside the department itself. Officer Caleb Harris, Tate's former rookie partner. A young cop who had spent 2 years watching Tate abuse his power, and who, until now, had stayed silent. But the day after Maya's arrest, Caleb had reached out to Park, ready to talk. When he walked into the Internal Affairs office, he looked nervous, shifting from foot to foot, avoiding eye contact. "I became a cop to serve and protect," he said quietly, his voice shaking, "but Tate taught me the opposite." Park studied him carefully. "Tell us everything." And so Caleb Harris started talking. He told them about the false arrests, the excessive force, the routine racial profiling. How Tate had coached him on how to write reports in a way that made it seem like the suspect was always at fault. How Tate had threatened him when he started asking too many questions. "I was scared," Caleb admitted. "I knew if I spoke up I'd be blacklisted. But after what he did to Lieutenant Colonel Reynolds," he exhaled, "I couldn't stay quiet anymore." Maya, listening from the corner of the room, studied Caleb carefully. He had been complicit, yes. But today he was doing the right thing. And that mattered. Meanwhile, at the Riverside Police Department, Officer Tate was starting to feel the walls close in. It began with the stares, the whispers in the break room, the fact that his usual parking spot was mysteriously reassigned. Then came the transfer requests, officers who once tolerated him suddenly didn't want to be associated with him. And finally, the real blow. A mandatory internal hearing set for the end of the week. A hearing where every complaint against him would be reopened. Tate tried to laugh it off, still believing he was untouchable. "Just another witch hunt," he told his partner. But even as he said it, his confidence was cracking. Because deep down, he knew. This time, it wasn't going away. 3 days before the hearing, Rachel Park and her team made their move. They tracked down Riverside PD's IT specialist, David Lynn, the man who had been responsible for archiving police dashcam footage. Sitting across from Park, David looked hesitant. "If I do this, my job's on the line." Park leaned forward. "And how many people has Tate arrested who never got to keep their jobs, their freedom, their dignity?" David was silent for a long moment. Then he pulled out a hard drive and slid it across the table. "I made copies," he said. Park plugged it in. And what they saw? It was worse than they expected. Video after video of Tate pulling over innocent civilians, fabricating reasons for searches, using excessive force. Then came the most damning clip of all. Footage from Maya's arrest. They watched as Tate lied about why he pulled her over. Watched as he grabbed her arm aggressively, despite zero resistance. Watched as he whispered into her ear, drunk on his own power. Not so high and mighty now, Colonel. Maya clenched her fists. Park's voice was quiet but deadly. We've got him. The day before the hearing, something no one expected happened. Tate's own daughter, Jasmine Tate, showed up at Internal Affairs. A rookie cop in a neighboring precinct, she had spent years watching her father abuse his badge. And now, she was done being silent. I became a cop to help people, she said, her voice steady but sad. But my father, he did the opposite. She handed over her own testimony accounts of how her father bragged about his false arrests, how he coached her on ways to manipulate reports. The final nail in his coffin. Because if even his own daughter had turned against him, there was no saving him now. By the time Friday morning arrived, Tate had lost everything. His once loyal colleagues avoided him. His own daughter had testified against him. And when he walked into the precinct, he found his locker had already been cleared out. The message was clear. This was the end. And yet, even as he sat in the break room, waiting for his mandatory disciplinary hearing, he couldn't accept it. This isn't over, he muttered under his breath. But across town, Maya Reynolds knew better. Because the moment the hearing began, everything he had ever done was about to be exposed. And for the first time in his life, Robert Tate was finally going to face justice. The hearing room at Riverside Police Department was packed. The air was heavy with tension, the kind that made people shift in their seats, whisper behind hands, and avoid eye contact. This wasn't just a disciplinary meeting. This was the reckoning of Officer Robert Tate. At the front of the room, Tate sat stiffly at the defense table, his once pristine uniform suddenly feeling too tight. His usual confidence was gone, replaced by something new: fear. Because today, the badge wasn't going to protect him. Officer Tate, the review board chairman began, his tone sharp. We are here today to review the allegations against you, allegations that span nearly a decade. Tate adjusted his collar, clearing his throat. With all due respect, sir, I've only ever done my job. The chairman ignored him, flipping open a thick folder. In the last 5 years alone, we have documented evidence of 37 wrongful stops, 15 official complaints buried by superiors, multiple accounts of excessive force, evidence of racial profiling. Tate's jaw clenched. Then the chairman continued, his voice now ice cold. And one false arrest of a lieutenant colonel in the United States Army. A ripple of whispers spread through the room. Tate's hands curled into fists. He still thought he could spin this. He still thought he could get away with it. That is, until they played the first video. The room darkened as the projector flickered on. Up on the screen, the first video played footage from Tate's own dashcam. There he was, pulling over Maya Reynolds. They watched his smug face as he ordered her out of the car. Watched his hand tighten on his holster despite zero threat. Watched his aggressive grip on her arm. Then came the audio, his voice clear as day. Not so high and mighty now, Colonel. A gasp spread across the room. Tate's face drained of color. The chairman paused the video and looked at him. Would you like to explain that, Officer Tate? Tate's lawyer whispered furiously in his ear, but Tate was too stunned to respond. And then, they played the next video. This time, it wasn't just Maya's arrest. It was footage from dozens of other stops. A young black man being pulled over and questioned for looking suspicious. An elderly Asian woman being detained for loitering while waiting for a taxi. A Latina mother being accused of resisting when she simply asked why she was being searched. The pattern was undeniable. Tate had built his career on intimidation. And now, it was all coming back to haunt him. After the videos, the board called its first witness, Officer Caleb Harris, Tate's former rookie partner. Caleb looked nervous as he walked to the front, avoiding Tate's glare. But then, he took a deep breath and spoke. I learned how to be a cop from Officer Tate, Caleb said, his voice shaking slightly. He taught me how to make a stop look justified, even when it wasn't. He taught me how to phrase reports so they favored us, not the civilian. Tate's lawyer objected, but the chairman silenced him with a look. Continue, Officer Harris. Caleb nodded, glancing once at Maya, then back to the board. There were times I wanted to speak up, he admitted, but I was afraid. I knew if I said anything, I'd be labeled a problem. But what happened to Lieutenant Colonel Reynolds? That was the final straw. Maya watched Caleb carefully. He wasn't perfect. He had been part of the problem. But today, he was part of the solution. And that mattered. After Caleb's testimony, Tate finally snapped. He stood up abruptly, his chair scraping against the floor. This is a witch hunt, he yelled. The chairman remained calm. Officer Tate, please sit down. Tate's fist slammed against the table. I've done my job for 10 years. I put criminals away. I kept this town safe. The chairman stared at him for a long moment. Then he said simply, No, Officer Tate, you didn't keep people safe. You made them afraid. Silent. For the first time in his career, Tate had no power here. No badge to hide behind. No friends in high places to protect him. Because every lie, every cover-up, every abuse of power had finally caught up to him. Then tomorrow would be the day he lost everything. The final day of the disciplinary hearing had arrived. The room was standing room only, packed with officers, community leaders, and citizens who had waited years for this moment. At the front of the room, Officer Robert Tate sat alone, his once proud posture now slumped. His badge had already been stripped from his uniform. His gun had already been confiscated. But today would decide if he ever wore a uniform again. The chairman cleared his throat, addressing the room. Our final witness today is Lieutenant Colonel Maya Reynolds. Maya stood without hesitation, walking to the front of the room with the same commanding presence that had carried her through 2 decades of military service. She wasn't here for revenge. She was here for justice. She turned to face the board, her voice steady. This isn't just about one officer, she began. This is about a system that allowed him to operate unchecked for 10 years. The room fell silent. She continued, for years Officer Tate was protected by silence, by fear, by a system that valued loyalty over accountability. Maya held up a thick folder. This is the full record of complaints against him, all of which mysteriously disappeared. But not anymore. She placed the folder on the table in front of the chairman. Today the excuses end. Tate's jaw tightened, his fists clenching beneath the table. Because he knew this was the end. The chairman took a deep breath, flipping through the final reports, the evidence, the witness testimonies. Then he looked up. After reviewing all presented evidence, he began, his voice firm, this board has reached a unanimous decision. Tate held his breath. In light of overwhelming proof of misconduct, racial profiling, excessive force, and falsification of reports, Officer Robert Tate is hereby terminated from the Riverside Police Department. The room erupted in whispers. But the chairman wasn't done. In addition, he continued, his voice even colder, we are recommending full revocation of his law enforcement certification and referral for criminal charges where applicable. A wave of gasps filled the air. Tate's face drained of color. Losing his job was one thing. Losing his certification meant he would never work in law enforcement again. But criminal charges? That meant prison. The chairman closed the folder with a sharp snap. This board stands by this decision, effective immediately. Tate exhaled sharply, the weight of his downfall crashing down on him. As the hearing ended, officers began filing out, some avoiding Tate's gaze, others shaking their heads. Maya stood, preparing to leave. But before she walked out, she turned to Sergeant Vasquez, who had been watching everything from the sidelines. What happens now? Maya asked. Vasquez's expression was unreadable. Tate's lucky if he avoids charges, she said, but even if he does, his career is over. Maya nodded. That was enough. She had done her part. Now, the system would handle the rest. That afternoon, Tate cleaned out his locker, his hands shaking. His colleagues, the ones who had once laughed at his jokes, covered for him, looked the other way, now barely acknowledged his existence. One by one, they walked past him. Some whispered. Some just shook their heads. And then the final humiliation. As Tate walked out of the station for the last time, he saw them. 36 people. Victim. Community members. The people he had harassed, detained, humiliated. And standing among them? Maya Reynolds. Tate froze, his grip on his box of belongings tightening. No one spoke. No one shouted. They just watched. Waiting. And for the first time in his life, Robert Tate felt powerless. In the following weeks, things changed in Riverside. A civilian oversight committee was formed. A new training program was implemented, one that Maya personally helped create. Complaints were no longer ignored, but properly investigated. And most importantly, officers like Robert Tate were no longer untouchable. Months later, word spread. Tate was working night security at a mall. No badge, no gun, no power, and no one cared about his excuses anymore. The very system he had abused had finally turned against him. And Maya? She moved on, not because she forgot, but because she knew she had won. 1 year later, Maya stood before a group of police cadets, addressing them as part of the new training program. Power without accountability is dangerous, she told them. It isn't your badge that makes you a good officer, it's what you do with it. She paused, letting the words settle. Because one day, someone will challenge you, someone will fight back. She folded her hands behind her back. And if you're not doing your job the right way, she smiled slightly, you might end up just like Robert Tate. The room was silent. The message was clear. Because Tate's story? It wasn't just a cautionary tale. It was a warning. This wasn't just a story about one bad cop getting what he deserved. This was about what happens when people stand up, when they refuse to be silenced, when they fight back not with rage but with truth. Maya didn't seek revenge. She sought justice. And in the end, justice won. Because no badge, no uniform, no illusion of power can ever protect someone from accountability forever. And as long as there are people willing to fight back, corruption will never win.